Chapter 48. Nature-Soul Development in the Animal Realm. 16th August 1840. Morning. Writing is KJL, S, D, Andra U, Ants H. The Lord spoke through Jakob Lorber as follows. So that you can understand your current theme, provided by the friends of Jakob Lorber, which consists in the inner spiritual representation of a dove, it is necessary to take a few glimpses of what was communicated to you yesterday via the pearl oyster. Although the inhabitants of the air follow the inhabitants of the water, capture the higher level of further development, it is nevertheless necessary, when one has risen from the water, to first look over the surface of the earth, and to only then rise into the regions of the air, in order to make a closer acquaintance with their winged inhabitants. In the water there is a strange kind of creature, of a very shapeless shape, which looks no better than a multi-branched tree, and is called polyp by you. This polyp settles like a tree plant at any place, takes root there and seizes with its 4, 5, 6, often also very many arms or proboscis, the worms and other water insects coming close to it, and swallows them up in itself, by which it then, particularly in the lower depths of the sea, grows to a tree-like size. If thereby now its digestive organs became more solid and firmer, so it begins, also herein like a tree, to die partially, and lives on only in its outer, recently grown proboscis. However, little by little, especially if it begins to lack sufficient food, it will die completely. If this has happened, his whole formless being passes over into an innumerable multitude of small, reddish worms. These worms then feed, multiplying enormously, well comfortably on such a dead polyp. And when they so have eaten themselves to death in a way, then their life unites to one life, from which then a kind of fish appears. This fish is the same one that you know as cuttlefish, or cuttlefish worm, sepia, and has its home in large quantities, predominantly in the deepest depths of the sea. Its food also consists of a kind of black-brown worms, which have approximately the shape of an oat grain, are provided at its side like a fish with 2 fins, and know their enemy quite well. When our octopus wants to grab its meal, it clouds the water with a black juice, which also has a numbing effect on the small animal world. Well, this is how it always prepares its meals. And if it has fed on thousands and thousands of such worms for many years, it naturally dies in the multitude of its genus after having absorbed several million of such lives. These now so potentiated, united worm lives then again unite, as already known, in one, which of course no natural scientist has ever dreamed of. But I, as the originator of all things, know well all ways, which I have predetermined in my works. And thus I tell you that out of the union of such lives again another being emerges, namely the so-called sea hawk, or flying fish. This seahawk now feeds partly on the insects of the sea, but partly also on the insects it catches in a rapid flight in the air. Therefore, it also has, according to its inner configuration, a double arrangement, namely that of a fish and that of a bird. It has a bubble in its belly, which it can immediately fill with atmospheric air and, according to its intelligent capacity, empty again completely or half of it. But there is again for the natural scientists an indissoluble knot, because they do not know how the fish in the middle of the water comes to atmospheric air and where it takes it from. However, it will not be as difficult for me as for the natural scientists to solve also this riddle completely for you. So take note. The fish lets a few drops of water enter the bladder through a dedicated channel. Under the bladder, however, there is a dark, metallic-looking tissue. This tissue has the characteristic that it immediately assumes a temperature of over 80 degrees as soon as a drop of water is in the bladder above it. Through this suddenly generated heat, the water is dissolved in an instant into steam and thus fills the bubble with atmospheric air. This chemical action is, according to my will, as familiar to every fish, according to its needs, as the movement of your hands and feet is to you. Well, such an organization has our flying fish. But see, he couldn't fly like this yet, even if his wings were a mile wide. But besides this bubble, he still has pulled a lot of tubules or organs through his whole body which, if he wants to fly, are immediately filled with an extremely light gas. This filling is done in the following way. The atmospheric air is divided by an own internal electrical process. Thus the weight of the atmospheric air sinks as a dripping liquid in the bubble and is immediately transported out of the bubble by a dedicated channel, which opens only at such an occasion. The very light gas, however, then flows into the mentioned many tubes and deprives the meat mass of the fish of its natural gravity in a just proportion, so that its body becomes balanced with the atmospheric air. Now the fish stretches out its wings and can by this means naturally rise like a bird. Its fins then give it direction according to its intelligence, and its wings lift it to any desired height. See, this is now the mechanical nature of this animal. But as this animal lives on two kinds of food, so it also has two kinds of enemies. Namely, in the sea, a bigger species of predatory fish, and in the air, a lot of big water birds, which almost always punish this air usurper for its cockiness with death. Since this fish is now a quite good-natured species, the following division process happens after its exit from such life. The female parts, also the dumber ones, unites and immediately changes into a bird species, which is known to you under the name seagull, and is still limited to the food of water insects. But the male parts also unites with many of its kind, and it becomes the object of your present topic. And thus we would have come to the very meaningful dove. I tell you, like the lamb among the quadrupeds, is the dove among the inhabitants of the air, for which reason it is also well known to be presented by me as the image of meekness, yes, often also as the image of the holiness of God. And so this animal stands at the head of all inhabitants of the air, and at the same time, through its gentleness and complete harmlessness, on the last, that is highest, level, where their spirits, that is their soul elements, immediately unite in predominantly with countless spirits from other noble creatures to become human souls. Their feminine part corresponds to the gentle love, their masculine to the grace flowing from it. You will indeed ask yourselves, since there is such an enormous number of animal species in the sea, how all of them can get to the stage of the dove. But there I tell you, there are very many different kinds of the so-called polyp, and there exists then corresponding polyps for almost every animal species of water. And these polyps are throughout not, according to the opinion of your naturalists, a very lowest genus of the animal world, but rather true purification institutions, which constantly, ceaselessly, devour in themselves what they find. And so they are an intermediate level between worms and all possible fish species. For through them, the world of worms is taken to a higher level. The fishes, however, stand already all on this higher stage, because they become inhabitants of the air after their life unification. And so almost every fish species corresponds to a bird species. However, in the sea is still another species of animals, which is further formed through the shellfish life, already known to you, whose last stage of development is already so shaped that they can live partly in water, partly also on earth in atmospheric air. Similar animals are the tortoises as well as other tortoise-free toad or frog species, which animals are all already gifted with the senses of sight, hearing, smell, and feeling as well as taste. Furthermore, the sea calf, the sea lion, the walrus, and so also all quadrupeds are to be regarded corresponding animals as semi-inhabitants of the water and the earth, through whose genus unification corresponding quadrupeds of the earth originate. There is then still another third further development stage in the sea, which is however rarer, therefore also more magnificent and wonderful, of which I will give you more details at another opportunity. But now we return to our dove, which we want to illuminate even closer. A footnote. In these unifications, one must always think of the souls of the creatures, less of their physical bodies. For only the former live on as soul parts in the higher creatures. The bodies are dissolved into their atoms and serve the higher creatures only partially for bodily construction.